These are all dragons. I hardly think I even need to tell you how common they are in fantasy, because they exist basically everywhere, so you'd think every aspect of them would be properly covered and standardized. And you'd think wrong. Fantasy battles often throw in dragons, but rarely are the strategies properly thought out. Now, obviously the depictions of dragons vary massively from place to place, as draconic creatures appear in virtually all cultures across the world, but they can be broadly generalized into European and Asian dragons. And since Asian dragons tend to be more like gods than fantasy creatures, I'll be sticking to European ones. So, the modern Western depictions of a dragon, which I'm just going to call the dragon from now on, are fairly consistent. Giant lizards with long necks and large wings that allow them to fly. They are warm-blooded despite being lizards, and this is probably something to do with the fact that they can breathe fire. There is also a number of legs, and while some people will say dragons have 4 legs and wyverns have 2, and various other differences between them, in the modern use of the terms they're basically interchangeable, so I'm going to ignore any distinctions there. Dragons tend to have an intelligence ranging from a brute beast to a fairly intelligent human, and differing relationships with humans, so I'm going to go over 3 different battle arrangements: dragon versus army, dragon and army versus army, and dragon and army versus dragon and army.
3, 2, 1, fight!
First we have your standard army fighting a dragon. There are various reasons this could happen, but in general it's either an army, often mercenary or holy in nature, hunting down a dragon, or a dragon attacking a place, usually to get gold, but maybe they're just angry. These two are pretty different because the latter normally has a settlement involved, so we'll cover them separately. So here's an army on a battlefield. I'd use a real example like in the teleportation video, but I somehow doubt I'm going to find one. So here's a dragon. Now the standard dragon behaviour here is the dragon flies across the army, breathing fire below them, while people shoot arrows at them. It. I'm not really sure what pronoun to use for dragon. Let's just say it's Smaug and call him a he. Smaug! This is pretty decent on its own. If I were a dragon, I'd want to burn the people, and if I were an army, I'd want to shoot arrows. But in a world with dragons, I would not want to fight like this. So first there's the number of projectiles fired. Armies have had various numbers of archers throughout history, but the number is rarely 100%. A good way for a society to deal with dragons, if they're a regular thing, attacking settlements and the like, would be an English-style system where every man was just required to know how to shoot a bow, so when building an army, every man was already ready to be drafted. It's also worth mentioning the types of bows here were longbows. Very difficult to master, both because of the sheer amount of force needed to draw them, enough that the skeletons of longbow archers are recognisably affected with enlarged left arms, and effects marking on their left wrists, shoulders and right fingers, and because of the difficulty of aiming a bow when you're putting so much force into it. This is significant because how tough a dragon's hide is varies from scenario to scenario. Now sometimes dragons are shown wearing armour in battle, and ignoring how that would weigh them down because we're ignoring all the scientific problems with dragons flying already, this would probably be a good idea, but we're going to ignore it here because wearing armour and having tougher scales is basically the same thing in terms of being shot at. So almost regardless of how tough a dragon's scales are, a longbow will be a good idea because of the long part. Apparently we don't know the range of a longbow, which is a little odd as you'd think we could just try firing one. But we know the minimum practice range for adults was 200 meters, that's 220 yards if you're metrically challenged. And of course the longer range your weapon is the better, putting longbows far above normal bows when dealing with dragons. But you might be wondering, what about stronger projectiles? Well, the Romans would generally give their soldiers javelins to lob at their enemies, however these probably wouldn't be very useful unless the soldiers have the biceps of a god. Also they only get one shot this way. There are also ballista, which will probably be affixed to the walls of all cities if dragons existed, but in an actual battle I think it depends entirely on how tough the dragon's hides are. If they're damaged by being hit by a longbow, then portable ballista wouldn't be massively useful because they're expensive, unlikely to hit the dragon, and an easy target, unlike the cheaper volleys of longbow arrows. If the dragon's hides are tougher, then a ballista might be used. If possible, these ballista would probably be set up so they can be tensioned with a rope leading away from them, so then when the dragon comes close to destroy it, the ballista can be fired remotely, killing the dragon and having it crash land onto the ballista, hence why efforts would be made for it to be fired remotely. You don't want a dragon crashing on you. I should also bring up crossbows. Crossbows would also be useful. They're harder to produce but easier to fire, and you can get incredibly powerful ones like this 5-foot long crossbow, which you can only fire by getting down on the floor and pulling back the string whilst pushing the front forwards with your feet. This gives the crossbow a shooting range of half a mile and far greater accuracy because of the trigger, as well as extreme force on impact, though bear in mind, only a very powerful and advanced civilization is going to be able to make crossbows like these. Now obviously to climb down onto the ground requires a decent amount of space, but this shouldn't be too much of a problem, as troops will probably do a 20-20 and have to stand at least 2 meters apart from each other in order to minimise how many people could be killed by each one of the dragon's fire-breathing runs. This is unless there's some kind of magical heat shielding that can be put on shields, in which case the troops would probably be ordered to form a testudo formation whenever the dragon came in close, or everyone would just wear anti-fire armour. It is also worth mentioning that if you're hunting a dragon, it will probably be best to lure them into a kill zone with gold, or whatever dragons want, say in a canyon or similar with ballista all along the sides to fire down at it. But moving on to dragons attacking settlements, obviously most large cities and worlds with dragons would be expected to have some kind of ballista to fire at dragons from, and a defending army would be able to fire bows or crossbows from the walls or even rooftops. The main issue here is that fire-breathing runs would also destroy buildings, and it would be harder to organise and aim volleys of arrows at the dragon. However, otherwise it's not too difficult from fighting a dragon outside of a city. So how could a dragon counter these strategies? Well, the first is obvious: only fight at night. Considering they're able to fly, it's probably pretty fair to say that dragons will probably get to decide when and where they fight, unless they're ambushed. Dragons could also avoid being shot at by taking large boulders from far away and dropping them onto the enemy from so high up that they can't be shot back at. Given dragons don't have night vision either, armies could probably attempt to counter this by just not lighting any fires at night and distributing their troops so there's never too much damage that can be done by one rock, as well as getting into cover that forces the dragon to come in close, or, assuming dragons are protective over their young, trying to attack their nest or equivalent to force a close range encounter.
3, 2, 1, fight!
So the first thing to remember when dealing with dragons and an army working together is where the power is. Which is more powerful, the army or the dragon/dragons? Basically, is it a dragon with support or an army with air support? In which case it will probably be a dragon or dragons with troop support supporting an army. So first, how can troops support a dragon? The first question is whether these dragons can be ridden, and to what extent, as well as to what extent magic exists. So riding a dragon in flight would be very difficult. I don't really think I need to explain this. It's like a horse, but with vast amounts of wind, giant wings blowing more wind to buffet you, and occasionally fire being breathed in front of you, not to mention the inconsistent direction of down. In a less magical scenario, that might be basically it. However, in scenarios where dragons are dumber, they might need some kind of direction via a rider, in which case dragon riders would likely be incredibly prestigious and training-intensive positions, where you are quite possibly strapped down to the dragon. If this is a scenario with some kind of race of super soldiers, normally elves in these kinds of things, then there could be a number on the dragon firing down at the enemy. Likewise, if there are dwarven or other similar fantasy bombs that could be hurled off the edge, they would be hurled over the edge. Finally, if there's some kind of magic to eliminate the effects of wind, maybe cast by some kind of wind elemental or the like, much like attaching kinds of ballista to an elephant, you could attach a ballista to a dragon. Now, assuming the army with a dragon has more than just dragon support, fighting against a dragon and an army will change the distribution of the troops, because the army without the dragon does need a proper defensive formation to counter the enemy army. They can't spread out their lines like before because they'll need a shield wall against the enemy army attacking them. Now, this isn't necessarily that bad once the fighting starts. A dragon's unlikely to go on fire-breathing runs down their own front line because they'd kill all their troops. So the army will probably have a formation which is tight at the front but spreads out the further back it gets. As the armies move towards each other, however, the dragon will probably want to burn down the front line of the enemy army to knock out their organisation and allow their army to just roll into the other army. And which army is which is getting a bit confusing, so let's just say these are Gauls and these are Romans. So our Romans are having a dragon come at their front, and the front line can't fire back because they're about to crash into the enemy lines. The Romans will probably try and place some of their best archers, or crossbow people? I don't know. A group just behind the front rows of the charge to fire at the oncoming dragon while charging. The main problem here though is that killing the dragon doesn't necessarily help that much, because having a dragon crash all the way along your front line will do more than enough at knocking them into disarray. So deterring the enemy army from risking their dragon, and if that doesn't work, scaring the dragon enough for it not to make the run with loud horns and premature arrow volleys, and if it's the right kind of dragon, just sticking a large chunk of gold in a catapult and firing it off into the distance for the dragon to chase, all could be used. And speaking of scaring things, I can't finish this section without bringing up the sheer terror quality of a dragon. War elephants were known for one of their most powerful features being just the fact that they looked to strangers like gigantic grey monsters with a tentacle and 2 spears on its face. Likewise, without even attacking, a dragon will terrify anyone who hasn't seen a dragon before, and plenty who have, just because they're gigantic flying lizard birds that can breathe fire. And when approaching a green army, or one that hasn't seen a dragon before, the dragons could make plenty of headway just by flying around the terrain and breathing fire on the ground. Bear in mind, Alexander the Great managed to defeat multiple revolts just by getting his troops to march up and down in formation, scaring his enemies with a Macedonian soldier's sheer discipline. And if a marching band can do that, I wouldn't be surprised to see a good half of the Roman army vanish overnight. And finally...
3, 2, 1, fight!
So our Romans and Gauls both have dragons. Now, in general, I'm going to skip over dragon versus dragon dogfights because, cool as they may be, they're pretty scenario dependent and could probably take up their own video, so I'm not doing them. Having dragons on both sides causes various problems, the major one being telling the difference between them, and especially if they're in flight. If dragons can wear armor, then colored armor could be used to tell the difference, but if armor could weigh the dragons down too much, then there could also be some kind of basic dragon clothes on to distinguish dragons, which of course opens up false flag attacks where a dragon is dressed as one of the enemy dragons, attempts to land in their camp, and then just goes ham. Although dragon flight handlers and the like would probably know the difference when the fake one starts getting close. A bit like how zookeepers can tell the difference between zebras, but you would probably have no idea. Most of the former strategies still affect this, but with allied and enemy dragons in flight simultaneously, launching volleys of arrows could be far more dangerous as there's a risk of hitting an ally, and this is to the extent that there may be strategies of aerial combat which aim specifically to control the position of the enemy dragon whilst keeping them alive, so your dragon can get in close enough to attack the enemy army without them being able to fire back, although the exact ways these strategies would work depend massively on how intelligent and impulsive the dragons are. I'm also going to touch on using dragons as a troop transport. It seems unlikely that dragons would be able to move more than a few troops at once, but on a cloudy night it wouldn't be too unreasonable for the generals to try and smuggle large numbers of troops behind the enemy lines. I don't think this would ever be enough to fully surround them, but a secret force charging into an unprepared distributed group of troops at the back, who would all be carrying bows and crossbows to deal with the dragons, could probably lead to a victory in battle. Anyway, this video is coming out quite a bit later than my previous schedule. This is because releasing videos every 3 days is utterly ridiculous, so I've slowed down a bit because I had to take a few days off or I would burn out. I don't really have a schedule at the moment, so the next video will probably be out at some point. It probably won't be 3 days, it probably won't be like a year though. It's probably, a week, maybe less, maybe more. I don't know. I haven't worked this kind of thing out yet. Anyway, thank you and good night.